Hello everyone, it is Micah here. So some of you may have noticed I haven't posted anything in a while, and there's a reason for that, which I'm going to get into here momentarily. But for those of you who are still with me, thank you so much. I missed you too, and I'm so excited to be here again. So, I had a lot of plans going into Endwalker. There's a lot of updated guides I still haven't made, and there's other various topics I wanted to cover, which I thought would either be helpful or interesting. Maybe a little bit of both. But I had to walk away from Final Fantasy XIV for just a little bit. And it's because of Endwalker itself. Now, I even have the walkthroughs all written up, covering the new dungeons and the trials that were included in this expansion. But when I sat down to actually begin making them, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I had absolutely no enthusiasm. To say I was disappointed in Endwalker is an understatement. I've been playing this game for a long time, over a decade now, and I've cheered them on through all the mishaps and mistakes. I've offered constructive criticism on various topics, and I've actively been bringing in more players. But never, in all of that time, not even during the dark times of the first version, have I felt betrayed like I do now. So I went ahead and went home for a little bit, and by that I mean I resubbed to Final Fantasy XI because that's just what I always do. But I think it's time that I actually talk about the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Now, before I begin, I'm gonna say this. I'm not going anywhere, don't worry. This is not a Dear John video, but I do have a few things that I feel the need to talk about. When we left off in the amazingness that is Shadowbringers, we were on the brink of the conclusion to everything. The end times were literally upon us again. Hydaelyn had gone silent. The mighty nation of Garland fell. Members of the beast tribes were being kidnapped, and these strange new towers appeared across the lands. We had another new villain bent on the destruction of our star, co-hosted by a more familiar villain who frankly should have been written out about 2 expansions ago because out of all the villains we've had, he is just the worst. The groundwork had been laid for one of the most epic stories yet, and I was hyped. I was super hyped to see how we were going to bring an end to this decade-long story. But then Endwalker launched. Now, it really wasn't all that bad. Out of the 2 new jobs, I feel Reaper is done really well. It's fun to play, the aesthetics are fantastic, the weapon looks gnarly, and the story behind it was fairly good, which is honestly a nice change of pace. In my opinion, I always consider the writing for the job quests some of the weakest storytelling in the game, so it was a nice surprise to pay attention because I was actually somewhat interested for once. I haven't really delved too much into Sage yet, so I don't have an opinion there, but Reaper I felt was really good. The 2 new cities were also amazing. Charlayan in all its white marble and academic glory, a stark contrast to Rotted Hans and its amazing use of color and texture. Neither of the new cities disappoint visually, but being an academic myself, I have a natural draw to Charlayan, and Rotted Hans being heavily influenced by countries like India, is just stunning. I'm a huge fan of that whole area of the world. The art, the music, the architecture, fashion, mythology, I mean just absolutely everything from that area of the world I find extremely beautiful. So I'm always really happy when I see it as an influence in games, and I honestly wish we had more of it. I was also really impressed with how they did the stat squish. To be honest, I was hesitant to make more videos before Endwalker because of any of the changes and trials that would come from the stat squish. But it kind of feels like they didn't do anything at all. I mean, it was smooth as butter. But even with all the good, what I felt wasn't done so well is what forced me to take a break. So let's go ahead and look at that side of things. And now this is not going to be a complete list by any means. I mean, this video would be hours long if I deconstructed the story beat by beat to explain my disdain. So I'm just going to hit on the major points, the points that bother me the most out of the whole ordeal, and the points that made me come closer than anything to walking away completely. So coming out of Shadowbringers, I was excited to experience the end of this saga. I knew in my heart that it was gonna be epic, and I sat here during the months between Endwalker's announcement and its release, trying my best to wait patiently. I was getting my characters prepared and anything else for what was to come. And truth be told, I've been very critical about just how long they've been dragging out the Garland and Ascian storyline, no matter how good it was, as well as some of the choices they made, like having Garland fall off screen. And that did nothing but make me even more anxious, because again, they had to be planning something mind-blowing, right? So, right off the bat, we're sent to Charlayan. And it honestly did not disappoint. As I stated earlier, that city is absolutely beautiful. But then I started getting deeper into the story, and it just kind of felt wrong. The pacing of Endwalker from the beginning is not done well. The story beats seem almost haphazard, like they went from a major epic to a bad anime. And some of the choices they made, it just made the whole story feel a whole lot more clunky. Mistakes you would expect from a fledgling developer, but not from this one. For instance, every gamer knows that there is one kind of quest that's almost universally hated by almost all gamers across the board. Escort quests. Escort quests are some of the most reviled quests in gaming, so much so that we're seeing them less and less, to the point where many games just don't include them at all anymore. But here, the devs doubled down on escort quests, littering the MSQ with them, and then trying to sell it to us as a feature. It's not a feature. It's an annoyance that most gamers hate passionately. We know that Square Enix is a good developer, with devs who play MMOs themselves, which is what made this choice even more perplexing. Yes, I get it, it does provide more lore, which is exactly what they were going for, but that lore could very easily be moved somewhere else. Very few players are going to want to stop mid-quest while already being annoyed by having to escort this random NPC around the map just to click on that NPC for a few lines of dialogue that they could otherwise skip. This is just so incredibly tone deaf that it almost makes me angry that a developer we know and we love so much would make a feature out of something like this. I mean, what? But back to the story. So the MSQ was basically split into 4 chapters: the Prologue, Garlemald, the Moon, and the End Times. Now, as you can see, I did not add an epilogue because the actual epilogue barely exists. I assume they might do something more in future updates, but this was the end. This was the finale of a 12-year-old story. There really should have been more than just that little cutscene we got in The Rising Stones. I mean, come on. But the prologue was short and sweet. It was split between 2 areas to set up the story, much like they've done in the past. But unlike other expansions, there was really nothing special here. In Shadowbringers, the prologue really gave us the sense that we were walking on the shores of a dying world. Between the design of the map, the story itself, and the music, the end, and just the despair of the people on the first was heavy in the air. But here, not so much. It felt almost like just another day, and the only real purpose this intro seemed to have was to tell us why tempering was going to be completely ignored from here on out. And this was the first thing that struck me as being really off. So yes, I understand that we now have a cure for tempering. And yes, I understand that the people of Rod at Hans have been working on these amulets for quite some time. These are always the 2 excuses people have been using to say why this is irrelevant, but it's not. The construction of the amulets was never mentioned, and the timing of their completion was just way too convenient. I mean, this really should have been introduced either in Shadowbringers or later on in Endwalker, after there was already a time where these amulets could have been of use, but we didn't have them. And why introduce and make such a big deal out of these towers, which were basically nothing more than giant tempering and summoning machines, if you're just going to completely nullify their threat in the first hour of the expansion? Even with a cure for tempering, these towers could have provided us with a pretty substantial threat. And with as big of a deal as that they've been for the past few updates, it was really disappointing that they weren't. And they were just a plot device for a really weak plot point. Next, we went and entered Garlemald. And this was honestly really exciting for me. I mean, Garlemald has been another major plot that we've been hearing about for the entirety of this game's life. So seeing it, even destroyed, albeit a bummer, was almost like seeing Ishgard or El Amigo for the first time. The quest with Thancred that led us there was also really great. I mean, weaving through those checkpoints, setting and disarming traps, that was fun. Although a little bit too short and way too easy. But once we got there, everything just became confusing again. The Scions, especially Elfino, who you think would know better due to his natural flair for diplomacy, seemed surprised that we were not welcomed with open arms like saviors to the realm. I mean, did he never think to himself that we not only, first of all, looked like an invasion force, especially since the caravan was being led by the freaking Warrior of Light, but also that the people were obviously fed a steady stream of propaganda for decades, and likely wouldn't be too keen to see us. I mean, it just made the leaders and the so-called diplomats of Eorzea seem incompetent at their jobs. I mean, even a decorated general kills himself at our approach. And it's not like that should be a surprise when we've had spies in Garlemald, including Thancred this whole time, who would have known and relayed it to the rest. Now, I did like the quest In From the Cold. I thought this was one of the high points of this section. But of course, it was quickly nerfed by Square Enix because a few people had complained about the difficulty. And Square Enix is quick to pull that nerfing trigger. But this quest was interesting, and it was different. I mean, sure, it was a little bit difficult, not in general, but for the MSQ it was. I will admit that, but it wasn't enough to nerf it. I'm not going to go there today, though. As a fan of stealth games and old school MMOs where spatial awareness and dodging random enemies walking around was and is important, I do have a bias. But weaving between mobs looking for recovery items and fuel while in a weakened state was crazy good times in my opinion, and I would honestly like to see more of this. It felt dangerous and it made me actually stop what I was doing and pay attention. I had to focus on the game, which we frankly get very little of, and it felt really good. So kudos for this one. I would love to see more of this in the future. I also want to say that I was pleasantly surprised with how Square Enix treated the citizens of Garlemald. In war, as we all sadly know, the citizens of any country we're in conflict with are usually seen as an extension of the government and demonized. Between propaganda campaigns and the general lack of knowledge people have about other countries, especially countries they're in conflict with, the people can easily no longer be seen as people. They are the enemy. And the way Square Enix humanized the people of Garlemald in the short amount of time they had to do so was actually very well done, and I do give them a round of applause for that. But between the prologue and the Garlemald chapter, Square Enix also made another huge and glaring misstep. Now, when it comes to this one, I want to have a sit down with the person who made this decision and have them explain to me point by point exactly what their thought process was when they decided to do what they did. Because this is one of those things that pissed myself and quite a few others off. And it should have been obvious to anyone at Square Enix that it would. They took not one, but two bosses that have been highly requested by their player base and are much beloved by fans of the Final Fantasy series in general, and reduced them to bosses in story dungeons. And of course, I'm talking about Anima and the Mega Sisters. These two encounters could have been freaking incredible battles in Pandemonium, which is a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to touch. But no, they were reduced to bosses of content that is designed specifically to be some of the easiest content in the entire game. They were barely mentioned in the story quests, and they were absolutely trivial to defeat. I mean, why? This is just such a glaring mistake, and man, you have no idea how upset this made me. You should have actually been here and heard me cussing at my screen, because it got plenty colorful. But let's go ahead and try to put all of that aside as we go to the moon. A place that was a huge hype point in all the advertising leading up to Endwalker's release, which frankly just made it even more disappointing when it fell completely flat. So we get to the moon, and it looks really neat. I mean, it's the moon, of course it's gonna look really neat. But after just a few short cutscenes, we're put face to face against Zodiark, only to take him out with barely a twitch of our sword arm. Zodiark, the big bad guy we've been hearing about for 12 years, the god that inspired the Ascians to destroy world after world in order to resurrect him, just dies. And then instead of having to deal with any major fallout, we spend the next series of quests dealing with the Loporits, these rabbits who are in charge of guiding us to a new planet. We spend roughly the next 10 quests, give or take, trying on clothes for them, collecting and sampling carrots for them, answering any questions they have about our accommodations on the moon, and doing a series of silly little quests that were added for what felt like no other reason than to pad the amount of time we spend on the moon and bring a little bit of that trademark kawaii to the game. Time that would have been much, much better spent investigating and dealing with Zodiark. What made this whole section of the story feel even worse was later on we find out that these rabbits have been talking to the scholars of Sharlayan, and they have been for decades, but they didn't even bother to ask what humans or Elizans or what we eat for breakfast. And there's rabbits whose sole job is to grow and prepare food for us. Nothing we did here had any point. It was all just padding, and it felt like it. But after we leave the moon, it only gets worse. So the end times are truly upon us. People were transforming into horrific monsters, which only caused more people to turn into more horrific monsters. But did we stay and deal with it? Nope. We went looking for more information on what was happening, which honestly wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't know why you'd send your number one warrior to do this, but they sent us. But the way they did it, time travel. Time travel is a plot point that every writer is told to never ever deal with in a story that's not based and set up around time travel, like the time machine. It's never handled well. It creates a plethora of plot holes that can never really be explained in a reasonable manner. And then to top it off, they added a memory erasing device. Now, I will say, it was amazing to see at least a small part of the Unsundered world, and it was amazing to spend more time with Emmett Selk, the best character in this entire game, in my opinion, and I will fight you over that. He is the best character in this entire game. But the time travel and the whole memory wipe things were a disservice to him. They were a disservice to the Ascians, and they were a disservice to this game in general. Now, I know they wanted to shoehorn in the Unsundered world somehow, but this was just a horrible, horrible way to do it, and it left us with a lot of what ifs and what abouts. The Unsundered world should have been left to our imagination. There was literally no point for us to actually go there. Not only that, but this really made Hydaelyn look bad. I mean, we're supposed to be her chosen. We're supposed to be her children who fight for her and who fight for the realm. But this just made her look like a self-righteous, egocentric piece of genocidal garbage. This whole section of the game could be used, without a doubt, in a fiction class about what you should never, ever do in story writing, which is only made worse by the fact that we know the writers of this game are not bad writers. They've crafted an amazing story up to this point. But it gets worse. When we finally come back to the present, we go from a society that's still fighting with swords, who's barely scratched the surface of technology, to a society that's completely competent in intergalactic travel. Now, I know that you have to suspend your disbelief when experiencing a story, but they have taken quite a few leaps, and when you stop and you actually look around, it becomes more and more difficult to do. I mean, think about it. In A Realm Reborn, which was only a few years ago when it comes to the scope of the story, we were given a set of quests for the Ixal to try to help them make airships that could fly higher, because there was only a certain distance in the air that an airship could go before it would just kind of fall back to the ground, if memory serves. I don't know, it's been 10 years. But now we can travel across the galaxy in just minutes. I mean, really? What? There's just so much that does not make sense with this. So much that needs more explanation, and so much that just should have been dealt with another way by the writers. But even after all of that, it still somehow gets worse. So you see, when we finally get to the end, the big bad is revealed. And I had money on the big bad being a being like Atomos. Now, not the Atomos we have already, but a version of Atomos from games such as Final Fantasy XI, where this Atomos is a being that's beyond a god, who could devour worlds and even time. And that made sense to me, since we already saw smaller versions of Atomos spread throughout the land, and they were even appearing around Aetherites to consume the Aether just before the Calamity during version 1. It made sense, a lot of sense to me, and that's honestly where I would have gone with it. I also thought that perhaps the villain could be one that we're already familiar with. I mean, we have enough of them. Or what if, and this was actually my personal favorite thing that I had in my head, is what if the cause of the end times was us? What if we set off the chain of events that would eventually lead to the end times and the summoning of Zodiark and Hydaelyn? When we traveled back in time, this is definitely a possibility. And how would we have dealt with this, knowing that the destruction of the ancient world, the reflections already destroyed, the calamities, and the thousands of years of death and destruction was all our fault? That would have made for a truly epic plot twist with so many interesting ways to conclude the story. But no, in the most horrible, trope-laden, cringy way, they introduced us to the true evil. The evil that was responsible for not only the near death of our home, but likely the cause of the destruction of world after world throughout the galaxy. A small preteen girl, or a group of small preteen girls, who just happened to be full of angst and godlike powers. A character we've never heard of, has never been referenced, and is not even introduced until right before we have to kill them. I mean, seriously, who wrote this story? Who approved this story? I mean, come on, it feels like a crime that they did this. This whole thing is just bad. Like I said, I feel betrayed. I've been playing this game for over a decade. I've been invested in the lore. I've been invested in this world. I have forgiven missteps, and I've cheered them on while offering what I felt was constructive criticism instead of just criticism. And they do this? This was a slap in the face to all of the fans. This is a blemish on the legacy of Final Fantasy XIV. I also feel really bad for all the new players we've gotten over the past few years. I mean, we've been harping on just how amazing this game's story is, and we've been building up the lore like it's some magnificent beast. And Square Enix basically went and made the Final Fantasy XIV version of the 8th season of Game of Thrones. I mean, look, I know I'm being hard on the writers right now, but we have certain expectations of them, simply because we've played this game and we've experienced this story, and it's been magnificent, especially in Shadowbringers. We know what they're capable of. We know that Square Enix in its entirety is an amazing game developer. They do magnificent work, but this was just and what makes it worse is that it's the finale to the story they've been telling since 2010. So this is me pleading with you, Square Enix, to do better. We know you can. Okay, anyway, what I'm gonna say to end this is yes, I'm extremely disappointed. This story was an absolute train wreck. But no, I'm not gonna stop with the videos. I'm just gonna go ahead and jump right back in and start checking off all the topics I had on my list. So I'm not going anywhere for now. And yes, if you have any ideas on or topics that you want me to cover, you can feel free to send them to me and I'll do my best to get them made. But anyway, go ahead and discuss in the comments. I'm sure I can hear some of you angrily typing away already, but I always like to hear and consider different perspectives. And who knows, you may just be the person who changes my mind. It's going to take a lot of work, but it can be done. It has been done before. So, and also be sure to follow me on Twitter and drop me a like and a sub if you enjoyed this video and you have not already. No pressure though, never any pressure. And as always, it's been a hoot. Until next time, have fun.